for so many minds. They are lured by and also find hard to relate to that sort of unbreakable faith in the reality of God. From a theological perspective, in other words, the problem posed by the Holocaust is one of anger rather than doubt. If doubt is a metaphysical category, anger is in this context, a relational one. God's ways may be frustratingly mysterious, but this does not, as a rule, give rise to the fear, let alone the conviction in Heschel, that maybe there's no one out there. There's another striking point to notice about this that I think is actually kind of breathtaking. Remember when I first noticed this, it sort of blew me away. Heschel expresses anger basically always in addresses to God rather than in discussions about God. So much so that whenever Heschel begins to talk about anger, he immediately shifts from the third person and shifts into the second. I'll say that in a slightly more abstract way. He cannot allow himself to go down that route in a philosophical mode. He immediately moves into a liturgical mode. He prays in his text, right? It's extremely interesting to think about that, how relentlessly relational this is. Already in Heschel's earliest poems, written as a teenager, we find abundant expressions of outrage, but they are always articulated in the second person rather than the third. Similarly, in Man Is Not Alone, the turn from theodicy to protest is articulated by the psalmist and his direct address of God. Why do you hide your face? In a famous presentation to Quaker leaders in the late 1930s, Heschel weaves together his disillusionment with humanity and his disappointment with God. Speaking of humanity's failure, he writes that, quote, "There has never been more reason for man to be ashamed than now. Where were we when men learned to hate in the days of starvation?" End quote. Speaking of God's inaction, he begins with the third person. The day of the Lord is a day without the Lord. Where is God? But then, characteristically, he shifts immediately to the following. Why didst thou not halt the trains? He's giving a lecture to a bunch of Quakers about theology, and he can't help himself. He immediately shifts and he says, why didst thou not halt the trains loaded with Jews being led to the slaughter? It is so hard to rear a child, to nourish and to educate. Why dost thou make it so easy to kill? End quote. Where protest is concerned, in other words, the overwhelming thrust of Heschel's writing remains staunchly, even stubbornly relational. As he puts it in a poem written when he was just a teenager, why don't you help? You. By the way, I find it odd that people suggest that Heschel, who wrote poems when he was a teenager, that expressed incredible anger at God, that the argument would then be, though, but after the Holocaust he wasn't angry anymore. He had solved it. It's a very odd progression. I find it to be an unlikely intellectual progression. Right? It's a very unlikely spiritual and intellectual progression. It's not impossible. People mature and they mellow, but the burden of proof is on them, I think. Another way of saying this, as I said, is religious doubt, or religious crisis, better, is dealt with liturgically rather than abstractly or philosophically. As a footnote to this, I'll say there are a couple of passages in Heschel's last book, Passion for Truth, where it seems like he's willing to start talking about metaphysical doubt in a way he hasn't until those last days. As for example, he describes the Kutzker wondering whether, quote, something had gone awry in heaven. That I think is a very uncharacteristic sentence for Heschel. I always find it extremely interesting, right, in that sense that he writes that book and then a couple of days after finishing it, dies. Something hugely tragic to contemplate about that. Now, just 3 sentences in closing. For a reader insistently looking for resolution, for a human being wanting answers, Heschel's grapplings with faith after the Holocaust, I think, can be quite frustrating. We can imagine one reader asking, if Heschel believes so deeply that God has granted freedom to us and that we, not God, built gas chambers, then why is the Holocaust such a burning theological problem at all? And yet we can imagine another reader at the same time, maybe it's just us in a different minute of the day. If Heschel is so disappointed with God's silence, so much so that he realizes that his own ideas are ultimately inadequate in addressing the Shoah, then why doesn't he just give up on faith and accept that we live in a godless universe? But that is not Heschel. He wants to live, he insists we have to live with both poles. Utter certainty that there is a God, and not just a God, but a God, as we saw last time, who cares. and at the same time, a willingness to admit, however haltingly, however stammeringly, that affirming faith, after all that he has seen and been through, is not a facile matter, and is at times actually excruciating. So I have no idea how you end a lecture about this, just as I suspect Heschel had no idea how to end his chapter. So I'll say something in my own voice rather than Heschel's. And that is, it has always struck me that a very important, integral piece of what it means to have faith is to commit to building a world where it's less offensive and implausible to have faith. And I suspect, based on a couple of passages I didn't have time to talk about, in A Passion for Truth, that that's a thought Heschel would very passionately have embraced. The best playing out of religious passion and doubt is precisely in making it less implausible to go on talking about that God of pathos who really cares. Thank you. Take a round of questions and then see what I can do with them. All right.
So I read the Passion for Faith many years ago, I don't remember it, but I think I do remember that the story withdraws from the world. And Heschel, certainly in the 60s, takes Charles.
Yes.
So how do you, well, that's my question.
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. And he spends much more time on the Kutzker withdrawal from the world in his Yiddish biography of the Kutzker, which is much longer and very different. If anyone here wants a somewhat obscure project for a dissertation or a book, it would be to actually compare systematically how Heschel portrays the Kutzker in Yiddish and how he portrays him in English, and what we can learn about who he thinks he's writing for in each book. Because they're very different, or at least at moments they're very different. I think it's a very interesting observation. I want to say two quick things about that. One is directly in a response, and one is very roundabout. The first is, Heschel is very careful to say in A Passion for Truth that although the Kutzker is a major piece of his religious life, he is not his Rebbe. And the reason why is that there's simply not enough gentleness there. Meaning there's not enough forgivingness. There's not enough willingness to make space for humans as opposed to merely judging them and tearing them apart all the time. Interestingly, that is one of the many theories. I mean, I don't want to get totally lost in this, but one of the great legends of Chassidut, one of the really great historical legends of Chassidut is the Kutzker's most important student is a man named Mordechai Lehner of Ishbitz, the Ishbitzer Rebbe, who famously leaves Kutzk. And while the Kutzker is alive, this is what you do not do, although it keeps happening. That's the controversy. You do not leave the Rebbe and start your own court while the Rebbe is alive. The Ishbitzer leaves, starts his own court, and the Kutzker is totally devastated. There are many, many, many layers of legend about what happened between them. Some of them are totally fascinating. But one of them is that the Ishbitzer basically says, I actually can't live with this. I cannot live in a religious world. I didn't really talk so much about this, but the Kutzker spends so much time telling people, like, you're dishonest, you're a liar. How do I know that? Because you're human. Like, I know what humans are. I've been around them. Just be honest. And at a certain point, he was just, I can't do this, right? This certainly has nothing to do with the Baal Shem Tov. This is not Chassidut. So, and I also think it's interesting that in his Yiddish biography of the Kutzker, 2 volumes long, he feels the need at the very end of the book to write a chapter on Mordechai Lehner's way. Very, very interesting. Meaning the Kutzker is extremely important, but the Kutzker is not Heschel. Now, I said last time, this is the second point I want to make, I said last time that the Rambam is sort of the bogeyman of Heschel's theology. He's the bad guy. The Rambam is, the importation of Greek metaphysics into Jewish theology. That is true. The Rambam is the bogeyman. That Rambam. But there's another Rambam who is enormously important to Heschel. And that Rambam is the Rambam that Heschel writes about as a 20-something-year-old in a biography he writes. And he says the following thing. He says, the Rambam's spiritual greatness in part consisted of the fact that as he grew older and he understood the implications of Judaism's obsession with chesed, the Rambam stopped writing philosophy and spent more and more and more time on his patience. That Rambam is his hero. And in many ways, I think he's telegraphing his own life in that biography. He's telling us what his life is going to look like. Michael Marmer, who's a professor at Union College in Jerusalem, has a really beautiful essay about this called Heschel's Two Maimonides. Right? One of them is everything that's wrong with Jewish theology, and the other one is the paradigm of what a Jewish thinker ought to be. Eventually, he stops writing complicated thoughts. For Heschel, that becomes about, and he's very explicit about this, I'm sitting in my office revising chapters about the prophet Amos, and at a certain point I realized, Amos would probably be talking about civil rights, not Amos. And so yeah, I think your question is actually very astute, both about his relation to the Kutzker, and also about his vision of spiritual life, and about being constantly pulled back into the world. I said I would take 3 questions, but that one was so good that let's take a couple now.
So I was just really interested in the whole idea of Heschel maintaining a relationship with God as opposed to losing faith. And
Right.
it's more important to be angry with God than to turn away. And I'm wondering if that seems like it's a Jewish value that I've encountered in other realms. And I think that a lot of Jewish traditions are recognized kind of the good and the bad. Like on Pesach, we take wine out of our cup to acknowledge the 10 plagues and the suffering that happened there. And I have a rabbi in Baltimore who says, be critical of Israel. Just have a relationship. Even if it's critical, don't turn away. So I'm wondering if there's a place maybe in the Bible that kind of embodies that value of engaging as opposed to turning away, or if it's not in the liturgy, if it's somewhere else.
Okay, actually, you know what? That's another one that I can respond to that one fairly quickly, even though it's a really interesting question. I would say that that's the dominant assumption throughout the Bible, meaning Job refuses to curse God and walk away. Right? That's what you're talking about. And this Psalm too, Psalm 44 does not say, Gamarti, I am done with you, Ribono Shel Olam, even if you're out there, you're not worth my time. Right? In other words, these are all... Now, the question that you're asking, is there a biblical text that says that in some abstract way? Of course not, because the Bible doesn't have that kind of abstract conversation. But in other words, I think there are countless texts that perform the very thing you're talking about, which is frustration becomes brought into a relational encounter. I mean, all the Psalms of Lament in the book of Psalms, whether they're individual laments, oh God, I can't believe this has happened to me, or national laments, I can't believe this has happened to us, are about that. You find this also, I think, an interesting person for thinking about what you're talking about is also Rabbi Nachman of Wroclaw, who in many ways is, I think Art Green, I don't remember if this is in his biography of Rabbi Nachman, or certainly in things that he said in public, I think it's actually a very interesting comment. What makes Rabbi Nachman modern in the way that the Baal Shem Tov is not, is actually a very fascinating comment. He says, for the Baal Shem Tov, the problem is guilt. What if I can't get over my sense that I did something wrong and God is upset with me? For Rabbi Nachman, the problem is very much guilt. Rarely has a Rebbe been more obsessed with guilt than Rabbi Nachman. There's also this little birdie in his head that says, somebody out there. And what Rabbi Nachman does again and again, say, if you feel that way, pray about it. That's the relentlessly drawing back, and you treat metaphysical doubt as relational distance. Now, a certain kind of philosopher might say, but that's a cop-out. I want to have an abstract philosophical conversation. And I think Rabbi Nachman might say something like, I'm not sure that's how relationships get healed. And then you can go round and round. But I don't want a relationship anymore. Really? Then why are you so angry? I think it's a very interesting. So I think you find that in a variety of different iterations and voices. Okay. Now I'm really going to take a round of questions. No one has anything to say. Amazing. I'm warning you that if you don't ask something, I'm going to give another 20-minute lecture.
It seems that Heschel sort of belittling God in a way.
You just speak up and drop it. Belittling God.
Yeah, belittling God. Pretty much taking out God's will in the equation and, all of the covenants that we have and things like that, where we turn away and it's kind of, just an automatic response, and that's it. No matter how bad things get and how bad we cry out or...
So just explain to me what your question is. You mean it's belittling God in that it makes God seem immoral, or it's belittling God in that it doesn't take seriously that God acts immoral, or both?
Both.
Okay, all right, let's take a couple more.
This might be a slightly strange question, but I don't entirely understand why this matters if for Heschel, if there are two assumptions that still hold for him. First, that God exists, and second, that God still has a kind of relatively, it seems, and maybe I'm wrong about this, it seems like a relatively traditionally kind of just a standard approach to the relationship between God and Halakha and Israel. So if both those things hold, does it really matter what God is like? Because we have to do what is taught, and then there's a tradition that explains how that's taught and what it is.
Okay, let me try to respond to that in a minute. These questions are complicated, I'm going to forget them.
This insider position of Heschel, is it a philosophical position, or is it just a feeling? And if it's philosophical, where can one find it?
Three very interesting questions. Couldn't someone just ask me, what does he say in chapter 18? Give me something to work with here. Okay, so belittling God. I'm going to tell you what I think Heschel would have said to that question. And, obviously, I think one could go many rounds on this. I have a feeling, and again, I don't want to be held to this. This is my first attempt at an answer to what I think I hear in your questions. I think Heschel would say that, and he says that in a passage I quoted briefly, flattering God by saying, oh God, it's all great, you are just wondrous and beautiful, and everything that ever happened that was bad is not your fault. That kind of flattering of God, that's belittling God. Because that's actually assuming that God is above, or most likely beneath, genuine relationship. That actually, now I don't know if Heschel would have said these words out loud, but actually refusing to acknowledge one's disappointment in God is belittling in the same way that being in a relationship, in the same way, in a parallel way, that being in a relationship with a person and going on and always feeling like, you know what, I can't talk to that person anyway, really. That's like the end of many marriages, right? Is the moment when the thought appears in someone's mind, I'm not going to bring this up again. Nobody there to listen. It's over at that point. The only question is when. But it's over. And forget about, you don't even talk about marriage, talk about people's relationship with their parents, right? When the moment when you realize, oh my God, chasal, I can't do it anymore. There's nobody listening. So I think Heschel would say, the fact that I am grappling to this degree is precisely a refusal to belittle God. It's actually insisting that God is genuinely relational. Now, is it belittling God in a different way to talk about God as if, God is not actively powerful in the world? I think Heschel would say, look, first of all, I have theological precedent to stand on. And second of all, I really believe, see, this is where the rub is. And if Heschel doesn't think he has solved the problem of evil, I don't think I've solved the problem of Heschel on the problem of evil. I think I've tried to portray a much more complex picture of what's going on here. I think, he would want to say something like, it is the case that God has to not be actively omnipotent in order for human beings to have any dignity or freedom. And yet. Now, other philosophers would say, many people in contemporary philosophy of religion would say, why are you saying that and yet? If you're going to say that, say it. Then you have a problem for traditional theism. What about covenant? Right? And then I'm reminded, and Heschel would not have endorsed anything that Shai Held ever said, and vice versa. But Leibovitch had this inimitable style with utter disdain of saying, I don't have a lot of time for people who think that God's role is to be what he used to say in Hebrew, ha-manager shel historia, right? The manager of history. Now, I think in characteristic Leibovichian form that was like overly derisive of like 99% of people who believed in God. But I think that there is a way in which Heschel is saying that, right? In other words, it's not divine dignity to imagine that God runs every little detail of every little thing that happens in the world. It is divine dignity to assume that God is relational. This goes back to my lecture 2 times ago and this time. It is divine dignity to assume that God is relational enough to genuinely make space. Where the problem reemerges is, okay, but how much space? That's the problem, right? How much space is too much space? That, I think, is the theological problem that he's wrestling with. Now, why? Yes, if God exists and there is a traditional relationship to halakha, I think it's that second point, as I tried to begin to talk about in my talk about Revelation, I think it's slightly more complicated than that. But I don't think, you see, the way you just articulated the question, whether or not you meant to, is like actually a non-relational theology. Well, if there's a God, and God's will is reflected in Torah and Halakha, then we should just do it. That actually is perilously close to Leibovich. The problem is, I don't know whether Leibovich believed in God in a way Heschel would have thought was believe in God, and I certainly don't know that Leibovich believed that Halakha was the will of God. Right? It's actually what human beings do as a way of. Obviously, he wonderfully says that for Leibovich, what's important is not Torah min hashamayim, but Torah l'shem shamayim. Right? Not Torah from heaven, but Torah for the sake of heaven. But for Heschel, what you've just articulated is a huge problem. Because there's nothing relational there. Oh, God exists, and this is God's law, therefore I do it. But what about covenant? What about relationship? What about the mitzvah of loving God? I'm supposed to love a blank screen? A black box? I'm going to love that? At that point, I might as well go read the Rambam. Right? No, now you can say, like, yeah, great, go read the Rambam, it's pretty good, right? But I think everyone would say, like, that's not what I mean by covenant, by relationship, by mutuality, by love, by awe. So it doesn't do what I'm interested in. I'm actually interested in, because I, Heschel, believe that's what the Torah and Chazal are interested in, a God who's in relationship with people. So you can't just say, okay, but God's not relational, but so what? Because God's not relational, if that were true, so everything. So that's exactly where the rub is. Now, there is a strand in Jewish theology, and you could argue that it's the Rambam, and it's certainly true in certain 20th century Jewish thinkers who are much less interested in the relationality of God. But for Heschel, at that point, like, well, who cares? Right? I mean, I think there's one sentence in the contemporary Orthodox thinker Michael Wishigrad that Heschel would have embraced, although he would not have said quite this, like, fiercely. At a certain point, Wishigrad says, a God who is so transcendent with nothing else is effectively the same as no God. I mean, Wishigrad basically said, the Rambam is an atheist when we're honest about it. Now, the Rambam would have come out of his grave to kill him for saying that, right? I'm an atheist. My whole life is about yearning for God. You're insane. But what is Wishigrad actually trying to say is something like what I think Heschel is after, which is, without the relationality, what is this all about? That's the same reason, by the way, why God has to be other. Because if God, right, that's why God, for Heschel, that's why Heschel is not interested in the pantheistic streak of Chassidut. Because if God and the world are the same thing, if I can hold hands and chant, I am God and so are you, right? If I can do that, there's nothing relational there, actually, between me and God. There has to be otherness for there to be relationship. There has to be a space. There has to be a thou for there to be a bridge. And that's very fundamental. So the Rambam on the one hand, and strands of mysticism on the other hand for Heschel are both, in the end, religiously uninteresting because they collapse the very thing that most matters, which is actual relationship. One, because God is too far removed to matter, and two, because God is basically just us anyway. God is not other. Therefore, God cannot be relational. Now let me say think about the last question, Eric's question. Is that a philosophical position or a feeling? So I guess I would want to know what you mean by a philosophical position. Do you mean by a philosophical position something that is accessible to quote-unquote mere reason, abstracted from an inherited religious tradition? Is that what you mean by philosophical position?
I mean an argument.
Yeah, it's not an argument. It's not an argument. I think, if anything, what Heschel does here, okay, now, so I get your question. It's not an argument. I think what Heschel is doing here is modeling a certain form of piety. Not arguing for it. Not in this chapter, anyway.
No, but I'm asking you more generally.
About Heschel?
Yes.
So I think, as I tried to talk about in the lecture on wonder, I think that Heschel, here I'm like going out on a little bit of an expansive limb, but I'm going to say it this way. I think that one of the weaker points in Heschel as a thinker is that he often gets confused about the difference between an extremely powerfully evoked experience and an argument. I think that gets very muddled for him very often. He believes at times that if he can evoke an experience with utter clarity and power, if you can just sense the intensity of what it would mean to have the kind of wonder that is completely conscious of the presence of God, at times he thinks he's just proven something. And he's wrong. He hasn't done that. What he's done is actually given, what Goethe would call a remarkably thick description of what it looks like inside faith. I think Heschel is much better at what he in fact does than at what he at times seems to think he's doing. Right? I think Heschel is much more, let me say that in a different way, he is much more effective when he actually can just allow himself to be a phenomenologist, to describe what it looks like, to see the world through these lenses. I think he's much less convincing when he then thinks, and I've shown you why it can only be seen this way. There's an irony, by the way, in terms of how people think about denominations. Joseph Soloveitchik, I think, was much more, in that sense, not in many other senses, but in that sense, philosophically modest. Soloveitchik never will say something like, let me show you why you ought to believe this. Soloveitchik basically does what I like to call, just because it's pretentious and fun, autophenomenology. He describes his own religious experience, or what he imagines a religious experience looks like, and he basically says, you want to be part of this? Here it is. I won't water it down. I won't filter it. I'm not arguing for the reality of God. There's no argument in Soloveitchik for the reality of God. There's no argument, I don't think. There is a portrayal of different aspects at different moments of what Soloveitchik thinks it looks like to experience the world from a theistic perspective. In that sense, he's much more modest than Heschel. Or if you want to say it in a less flattering way, he's less ambitious than Heschel. There's an irony there because, there's a certain kind of stereotype of orthodox thinker. He must be very dogmatic. Yes and no about this. There is, it's almost like, it's very interesting, right? Some of what passes for philosophy, for religious philosophy in the 20th century, medievalists would have looked at it and thought they were crazy, right? So, I think I've said this in some context in these lectures, but Soloveitchik begins a book by saying, I am lonely, right? This is the beginning of a theological essay. I can imagine the Rambam reading that and saying, big whoop. What do I care? What does this have to do with God or theology or religion? I won't care. Why is that interesting, right? But Soloveitchik living in a totally different world where sort of phenomenological evocations of the struggles of faith are the coin of a lot of theology. He's not doing, another way of saying that is, I'm going to use terms a little bit distortedly. There's kind of two modes of doing theology, you could say. One is, let's call it apologetic theology, and I want to be clear, I don't mean by that the way people use the word apologetic locally. Apologetic theology is essentially the project of convincing you why you should believe what I do. And then there's confessional theology, which is, here's what it looks like to see the world the way I do. You like it, you relate to it, you're welcome to it. You don't, modernity's complicated. So Heschel believes at many moments he's an apologetic theologian. I think he's much better doing confessional theology than apologetic theology. Soloveitchik very rarely thinks he's doing apologetic theology. He's not engaged in that project. I think he's aware that it's a philosophical dead end. Okay, I'll take two more questions now.
This is a somewhat general question about Heschel, but I see it here really clearly, and I'm wondering about it. What I guess what about Heschel's framework for theodicy that he's presenting here is inherently and particularly Jewish, rather than, well, I guess rather than Jewish, Muslim, Christian, people that look to the Bible and
I mean, what's
and
behind that
take
question?
meaning
Is
for
it
it.
important? Is it important, and if so, why is it important to you when you ask that it be particularly Jewish?
It's not important to me that it be, but I'm wondering just because it strikes me so as such a universal assertion,
Right.
and I'm wondering if I'm just missing the particular elements of it, or if he's trying to make a claim that's very broad.
Okay, it's a really interesting question, actually, and it actually even gets to something very deep in Heschel, so we'll try to talk about it briefly.
In the end, sort of the point that I have, that Heschel's aesthetic side is like a horizontal plane, and it could never escape. So therefore, throughout his life, in the chapters that you did tonight, and the first time you said the lectures that you did, he had all these, what's called ontological type of questions. But he could never escape this emotional attachment side to God. So at a point in time, as you described at the end, which you sort of described as the end of your lecture, he was silent. But he really wasn't silent, because ontologically he was silent, but his emotional acidic side took him and propelled him forward to the point where, in terms of the things he did in social action and civil rights,
Right.
may have come from those grassroots.
Okay, so let me, at 3 minutes till 9 o'clock, I'm going to try to respond to each of them as briefly as I can. So, question is, what, if anything, is particularly Jewish about this? I think that Heschel would probably have said, well, actually, you know what? I want to be more modest in answering this than that, because I think a useful way of thinking about this, in terms of what we know about Heschel, is what's Jewish about this is that it takes place inside a set of assumptions and a given vocabulary that is entirely Jewish, right? In other words, the assumption is covenant. The texts that we're talking about are biblical and Hasidic. So it is like a thoroughly enmeshed Jewish question. But if by particular, the question is there a content here that a Christian or a Muslim could not share? I don't think it's particular, right? They might quote different texts, but I don't think it's particular. And I think that you're onto something very deep in Heschel, and maybe I'll just say this because there's no other occasion in the series where I can say it. I think it raises like very, very interesting questions, right? So there's a major debate in modern theology, and because Christians tend to think about method much more than anybody else, it's particularly true in Christianity. It's a major divide in modern Christian thought. Some people say, I think this is like incredibly interesting and relevant, even if theology is not your cup of tea exactly. Should theology begin by talking about some aspect of human experience that opens me up to the possibility of being interested in God or revelation? Or should theology begin, as Karl Barth famously said, with the data of revelation? What is theology? It is interpreting what I know because God has spoken. What Barth calls thinking after, nachdenken, thinking after, right? That's what theology is. Now, the first position says to the second position, right? How can you just begin with revelation? What is it in you that makes you interested in the first place? If you think you can just begin with revelation, you're lying to yourself. Or you're predestining yourself to being irrelevant to all but an increasingly small number of people. Right? Heschel very clearly is in the first school. That's why he begins with wonder. Wonder is not an experience that Jews have. Wonder is an experience that humans have. Now here's the challenge that people who begin in that way have. If you begin with something so humanly universal, how and when exactly do you move to the particular? How do you go from a universal human hunger to a particular response? That's the standard conservative, small c, attack on liberal theology. And in this domain, if only in this domain, Heschel is very much a liberal theologian. Great. So You start with human nature. How did you get to Torah? Or in Christians, how did you get to Jesus Christ? We're talking general human, how do you get to the particular? Right? And I think Heschel would say, I don't have an alternative. I don't have an alternative. Right? I have to. This is a great moment.
That was amazing. Oh.
I'm tempted to just say the word Gewalt. And just so now, the reason I just said that is because the struggle between wanting to talk about the humanly universal while genuinely taking seriously the particular is like the central problem of modern theology. Heschel, by the way, is very committed to and very interested in the view that Jews and Christians, I think he was interested in the view that not just Jews and Christians, but he died in 1972, where most of educated dialogue was about Jews and Christians, right? That Jews and Christians do share some of the most foundational and fundamental yearnings, struggles, aspirations. So if Christians could read this book and find this chapter compelling, even though the heroes are Job and the Kutzker, so be it. That's a good thing. So I'm not really fully answering your question. I think your question is a very good one, and it really goes down very deep to the problem. Heschel decides very clearly, I am going to start with the universal. And whether he does a good job of getting to the particular is an interesting question. By the way, the Rambam had that problem too. Oh, I'd love to have a 5-minute riff now on the Rambam, but the Rambam has that problem too. And by the way, if you don't think that it's a problem, I'll give you the following exercise. This is actually very interesting. Go home tonight. Read the Guide of the Perplexed from beginning to end. And then when you're done, read God in Search of Man from beginning to end. And count the number of times the word covenant appears in either of those books. And when it does appear in Heschel, how many times is it clear whether he means the covenant between God and humanity or the covenant between God and Israel? Because one of the dangers of starting with the universal is, how do you get that leap? It allows the Rambam to buck the whole Middle Ages and say, look, Jews are not different than Gentiles. The fundamental theological category is the creation of the world. So the Rambam becomes a kind of hero to a certain kind of modern. On the other hand, Mr. Rambam, it's all about monotheism. What about the fact that Muslims are a little more rigorous about it than we are? Rambam lost a lot of sleep about that. Right, so that's the danger of starting with the universal. Okay. Now, by the way, I'm in favor of starting with the universal. I just think you have to be aware of what's complicated about it. Now, the emotional attachment, in Chassidut, I think that that's right. I would only make the following kind of observation, which I think is interesting. There are two poles, I think it's fair to say, in Hasidic thinking. One of them is about God as Tatanu, like sweet Father, God who is intimate with us, who loves us. And the other is Dveikut, which in Chassidut, Shalom notwithstanding, seems to mean being totally merged with God. What I think is interesting about Heschel is he's totally preoccupied with the former and has absolutely zero interest in the latter. I'm going to talk about this a little bit next time. I think he thinks the latter is bordering on blasphemous. And he can't say that because he will never. One thing that's very clear about Heschel, by the way, one of the reasons he attacks Philo is because he does not want to be in a position of attacking the Rambam. I think one of the ways that Heschel is a post-Holocaust figure is he will not say anything to assault people he thinks are giants of the Jewish tradition. He won't do it. It's very, very interesting. I think it's a very deep piece of. By the way, I mean, ask students of Heschel, they will say, you could say a lot of things to Heschel. You said a bad word about Baal Shem Tov, you walk away. Even though he rejects so much of what's core to the Baal Shem Tov. The Baal Shem Tov thinks, we merge with God, we become one cosmic, I have no idea what this means. We become part of this kind of like absolute oneness with the divine. Right? Heschel has no interest in that at all. He thinks that's just not serious thinking. Right? It's very interesting, right? By the way, this is not me talking. I think it's Heschel. I happen to agree with it, but I'm actually trying to exposit Heschel for a minute. So, yeah, but the piece of the absolute sort of unbreakable sense of the reality of God, who is like above my shoulder at every moment, that I think is true, and that never leaves him. And that's part of what enables this absolute insistence on, I'm going to treat it relationally. I think, again, it's one of the things that creates a gap between many of us as 21st century American readers and Heschel. It's like, well, could you please just talk about for a minute the possibility that maybe there is nothing out there? I think Heschel is actually incapable of really imagining it. I think it's very interesting. It's one of the ways in which he is not, right, your typical 20th century philosopher, right? It isn't so clear to me, in other words, Levinas's image of an empty sky, it isn't so clear to me that Heschel was ever really able to really consider there was an empty sky. Maybe that there was a sky peopled by a god who had blown it, totally. Because after all, Tehillim thought that too. But that reality of God was just like, it literally was mother's milk. And I don't think that ever went away. To me, personally, honestly, that's part of what makes him so totally compelling and at times so frustrating. Because I worry, right, he doesn't actually get it. Right? He doesn't in some way. I don't know if that's true, but I think it's, on some level, it's true. Because that kind of metaphysical crisis of faith, I'm just not sure he had. Now, you could say that the crisis of faith he did have was much worse and more painful. Right? Elie Wiesel likes to kind of say things like this, right? The tragedy of being a theist is in some way much more intense than the tragedy of being an atheist. The tragedy of atheists, you have an answer, right? The tragedy of theism is you're stuck in this relational mud. But I think that's where Heschel really came. By the way, I think probably, Elie Wiesel has the same problem, or the same strength. He also, on some level, never left seeing it in that way. God is real, just very disappointing. So it's, everything he ever writes is the same working out. In a lot of ways, it's the same working out. It's like a really profound struggle. I really believe in this God, who I've been really let down by. How do I begin to make sense of what it means to be religious after all that, or in the face of all that, or embracing all that? Okay, thank you all very much.
Yeah. Hey, feel it. Hey. Thank you. Good, yeah.
Really,